Hey there, sleepless rabble. Let me take over for a while. You don't have to scroll, or count sheep, or wonder what that shadow in the corner just did. I've got a story for you. A real one. The kind that crawls under your skin and stays a while. Tonight, we're going back to 1949, to the quiet suburbs of Maryland, where a 14-year-old boy played with a Ouija board, and something answered. This is the true story that inspired The Exorcist, the movie that made you afraid of pea soup and Latin. But this version? It's darker, stranger, and unfortunately, real. So wrap yourself up, dim the lights, and if something knocks while I'm talking, don't worry. Probably just the pipes. Probably. Before we start, do the usual thing. Like this video, subscribe if you want more nightmares at bedtime, and drop me a comment. Do you believe in exorcisms, or was this just a case of one seriously messed up teenager? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to The Real Exorcist, a sleep story from hell. For sleep, obviously. Let's begin. Robert was, by all accounts, an unremarkable boy. 14 years old, average height, thin as a rail, with the kind of plain face that adults forget moments after smiling politely. He didn't cause trouble, didn't shine either, just existed, quietly. Somewhere between invisible and overlooked. The kind of boy who always sat at the edge of the class photo, half-shadowed, blinking at the wrong time. His name wasn't really Roland Doe, of course. That was the pseudonym assigned by the church, part of a long tradition of protecting those caught in the crossfire of something they couldn't explain. But for the sake of this story, we'll stick with Roland. It fits him. Soft around the edges, the kind of name that doesn't leave fingerprints. Roland lived with his parents in Cottage City, Maryland, a sleepy little suburb draped in post-war optimism. Lawns trimmed weekly, mailboxes freshly painted. Milk delivered in glass bottles with cheerful clinks each morning. It was the kind of town where neighbors nodded, boys rode bikes in slow loops, and women whispered behind curtains when something strange happened. Though nothing ever really did. The Doe household was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and wallpaper that peeled just slightly in the hallway. His father worked in communications, radios mostly. His mother kept the house, as mothers did, and Roland drifted between them like a ghost in training. He wasn't particularly close to either of them, but he adored his aunt, Harriet. She wasn't like the others, not like the polished women in town with their blue dresses and pressed curls. Harriet wore velvet in summer and carried an umbrella even when it didn't rain. She smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke, and always seemed to have a pocket full of something peculiar. Stones, feathers, tiny jars with illegible labels. She was, depending on who you asked, eccentric or dangerous. Harriet was a spiritualist, though she would have hated that word. She believed in energies. In ghosts, yes, but more than that. In patterns, in signs, in the thin veil between this world and the next. She spoke often of the other side, but never with fear. To her, the dead were not to be feared. They were simply further along. Roland listened to her stories with wide eyes and a hungry heart. She told him things his parents would never say, that spirits lingered in mirrors, that dreams could be messages, that some children were born with eyes that could still see the old things. She said he had those eyes. On quiet evenings, when the dishes were done and the town tucked itself into routine, Harriet would open her little black case. Inside, nestled in velvet, was her board, the Ouija, a relic from her youth. The letters had faded, and the planchette was chipped at the edges, but it still moved, at least when it wanted to. She let Roland try it once. Just once. His fingers trembling slightly, Harriet's voice soft beside him. Nothing happened. The planchette sat still as stone. Roland was disappointed. She only smiled. "It doesn't move for curiosity," she said. "It moves for longing." A week later, she was gone. No warning, no drama, just silence. She died alone, sitting upright in her armchair, a book still open in her lap. The doctor said it was her heart. Nothing violent, nothing theatrical, just a quiet exit. The kind she might have chosen for herself. Roland didn't cry. Not then. Not at the funeral either. He simply folded inward, as if something had been scooped out of him and no one had noticed. His parents tried to comfort him, of course, but there was a distance now. A thin pane of glass between him and the rest of the world. He didn't talk about her, but he didn't stop thinking about her either. Weeks passed. The world moved on, as it always does. The grass grew, radios hummed, the mailman whistled, but something in the house had changed. The air was heavier, quieter, as if Harriet had taken some vital sound with her when she left. One night, while searching for an old box of school papers, Roland found it, tucked away in the back of the attic closet, wrapped in a silk scarf that still carried her scent. The Ouija board. Dusty, worn, waiting. He took it to his room, no candles, no Latin, no ritual. Just him, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, the board in front of him like a game that had lost its rules. His fingers rested on the planchette. He didn't speak at first, didn't know how to begin. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of streetlights beyond the curtain. Finally he whispered, "Are you there?" Nothing. "Can you hear me?" Still nothing. "Is it you?" The planchette moved, just a nudge, a hesitation, a slow, sliding shift toward the word Y-E-S. Roland froze. He didn't move his hands, didn't breathe. His mind screamed that it was a fluke, a twitch, a trick of nerves and memory. But another part of him, the part Harriet had nurtured, leaned in. He tried again. "What do you want?" The planchette jerked once, then stopped. The room felt colder. The hairs on his arms rose. Something pressed in around him, like static, like breath on skin. He asked no more questions that night. The board went back in the box, shoved beneath his bed where even the dust was afraid to settle. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the breath before a scream. It began with scratching, not the harmless kind. No innocent rustling of mice or creaky wood, pretending to be alive. This was different. Sharper. Focused. It came at night, of course. These things always do. At first, Roland thought it was just his imagination. Grief playing tricks. Sound bleeding in from outside. The wind, always the wind. But then it moved. The scratching didn't stay in one place. One night it was above his bed, a faint skittering just behind the ceiling plaster. The next, it came from inside the wall near his desk. Another time, he swore it. Underneath the floorboards, directly beneath where he sat. Not random, not vague. It followed him. His parents brushed it off. "Old houses make noise," his father said, not looking up from his newspaper. "It's the pipes," his mother added, though she glanced at the walls more often now, her fingers twitching slightly when the silence dragged too long. The sound grew bolder, louder. There was a night when the entire headboard thudded against the wall with such force it woke the neighbors. Another when Roland cried out and his parents rushed in to find the mattress trembling under him like something writhed beneath the springs. But there was nothing there. There was never anything there. That's when the objects began to move. It started innocently enough. A pencil rolled across his desk when no windows were open. A chair shifted half an inch while no one sat in it. A drawer opened by itself. Just one. Just once. Roland tried not to react. He closed the drawer, picked up the pencil, told himself he was tired. But one afternoon, while his mother folded laundry in the next room, a framed photograph on his shelf spun slowly to face the wall. It didn't fall. It didn't wobble. It turned. Precisely. Deliberately. Like someone had touched it. He stood there for a long time, staring at the back of the frame. When he finally turned it around again, the glass was cold. His mother was the next to notice. A lamp flickered constantly in the living room, even after they replaced the bulb. Her cross necklace disappeared for 3 days, only to reappear coiled in the kitchen sink. The cat refused to go upstairs at all, hissing at the landing as if something waited there, just out of sight. She stopped brushing it off. She started praying instead. His father remained stubbornly rational. There had to be a cause. Maybe a prank. Maybe electrical issues. Maybe their son was crying for attention. But Roland wasn't mischievous, wasn't theatrical. He moved through the house like a shadow, sullen and silent, always watching something that wasn't quite visible to anyone else. Then came the night with the vase. It had been a normal dinner, quiet, tense but ordinary. Plates clinked, forks scraped. His mother asked about school. His father mumbled something about overtime. And Roland sat there, unmoving, staring at the hallway. The vase exploded. It didn't fall. It didn't tip. It launched itself from the end table against the wall with a crash that shattered the conversation. And the last bits of denial. Shards scattered across the carpet like tiny knives. No one had touched it. No one was near it. The table hadn't so much as trembled. His mother screamed. His father cursed, leapt to his feet, looked around the room as if someone had slipped in behind them. But the hallway was empty. The lights didn't flicker. Nothing moved. Except Roland, who stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the place where the vase had stood. After that, the house grew quieter, but not in the comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a scream, where every moment feels stretched, expectant. His mother began to burn incense in the kitchen, muttering half-remembered prayers under her breath. His father stopped reading the newspaper, and Roland changed. He stopped responding when spoken to. His eyes took on a glassy sheen, as if they were looking somewhere just beyond the surface of things. He began speaking to corners, to windows, to mirrors, not loudly, just murmurs, like someone whispering secrets to him in return. One morning, his mother found him standing at the foot of her bed, completely still, his hands at his sides, his eyes open and unblinking. She asked what he was doing. He didn't answer. She asked again. Nothing. She touched his arm, and he flinched as if burned, then turned and walked away without a word. She started locking her bedroom door after that. Things escalated, of course. They always do. But not just yet. For now, the house had slipped into a new kind of rhythm. One where no one slept deeply. Where meals were eaten in silence. Where every sound was measured, every light watched. And always, always that low hum beneath it all, like the house itself was waiting. The planchette remained under Roland's bed. He never touched it again. He didn't have to. Whatever had arrived had already made itself at home. By now, even the neighbors had begun to whisper. Something was wrong in the Doe house. The boy wasn't right. The curtains were always drawn. The mailbox overflowed. People came and went at odd hours. Doctors mostly. Some local, some not. No one stayed long. His mother had reached her breaking point. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. Her hands shook when she made tea, and the soft murmurs of prayer spilled constantly from her lips like a nervous tick. She had called every professional she could find. First a pediatrician, then a neurologist, then, when nothing explained anything, a psychiatrist. She didn't care anymore who believed her. She just wanted her son back. The doctors were baffled. Roland's body was healthy. His scans were clear. His blood work uneventful. He had no fever, no infections, no physical symptoms. Aside from the marks, of course. The scratches, red and raw, often appearing in real time as if invisible hands were dragging across his skin while someone watched. No one could explain them. And more disturbingly, no one even tried to. The psychiatrist fared no better. He spent an hour in the boy's room, sitting quietly, asking questions. Roland answered some. Others he ignored. At one point, he simply stared at the man for a full minute without blinking. When asked if he heard voices, Roland responded in Latin. The psychiatrist didn't return for a second session. More specialists came and went. They poked, prodded, measured, scanned, took notes, smiled with tight lips, and offered vague reassurances. Children process grief in strange ways, they said. He needs structure, patience, time, as if time had anything to do with what was happening in that house. And still, the nights got worse. The sounds intensified. Scraping, thudding, sometimes what sounded like breathing beneath the floorboards. Lights burst for no reason. Doors slammed without wind. Roland's bed would rattle violently, once lifting an inch off the ground while his father watched in stunned silence. The boy began to bruise. Dark purple blotches bloomed across his arms and back. Sometimes hand-shaped, sometimes like lash marks. His father accused his mother. His mother accused his father. The shouting only stopped when Roland laughed. Slow, low, and with a voice that didn't belong in a boy's throat. That was the night his mother called the minister. Reverend Luther Miles Schultzer was a Lutheran pastor who had known the family casually for years. He'd baptized Roland, performed the funeral for Harriet. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in demons, but he believed in suffering, and something about the sound in Mrs. Doe's voice made him come anyway. He arrived with a Bible, a notebook, and a weary sort of compassion. He wasn't prepared for what he walked into. The house felt wrong. That was his first impression. Not evil. Just off. Like a painting hung slightly crooked. He tried to pray with the family. The words felt heavy in his mouth. He spoke to Roland alone, gently, respectfully. The boy was polite at first, tired-looking, quiet. But then his expression shifted. His pupils dilated, and he began reciting scripture, backwards. The Reverend didn't mention that in his notes. He returned the next day, and the next. 3 days in a row, he stayed late into the night, observing, praying. On the third night, he witnessed the scratches form, just above Roland's collarbone, slow and deliberate. He watched the skin part, watched the blood well up, watched the boy smile through clenched teeth. He went home shaken, unsure or unsettled, and then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he came back again the next night. That night, he brought holy water. He sprinkled it lightly around the boy's room while reciting the Lord's Prayer. Roland sat silently on the bed, watching him. When the Reverend reached the closet door, the boy began to growl. Not speak, not shout, growl. It built in his throat like a low animal sound. The walls trembled, The bed frame creaked. One of the desk drawers slid open on its own. And Roland, without moving his lips, said in perfect German, Gehört mir. He is mine. The Reverend dropped the vial. It shattered on the floor. Water seeped into the carpet. The boy laughed. The Reverend left. He didn't return. Instead, he wrote a letter. Not to a doctor, not to a fellow Lutheran, to the Catholic Church. The Reverend's letter arrived quietly. Folded once, tucked into an envelope with no return address, it made its way across town, through diocesan hands, until it reached someone whose job it was to know what to do when all other systems failed. The contents were simple: a description, a concern, a plea. He had seen something he could not explain. He had prayed. He had invoked God, and the thing had laughed. He recommended escalation, Catholic escalation, the kind that comes with collars and crosses and centuries of uneasy history. And so, the church sent someone to observe, Father E. Albert Hughes, young, dutiful, and, as some whispered later, not entirely ready for what he would face. He arrived in early March, dressed in black, the collar stiff, his eyes steady in the way men's eyes are when they're hoping faith will be enough. He met Roland in the rectory, under fluorescent lights and the thick smell of old polish. The boy was subdued, polite even. But the moment Hughes placed a hand on his shoulder, Roland flinched, then froze, his expression slack. He whispered something unintelligible. The priest leaned in. What he heard, he never repeated. Still, he agreed to try. An initial blessing. A minor rite. No full exorcism yet. Permission for that required more. But Hughes did what he could. He placed his stole around his neck, held his prayer book tight, and began to read. Roland's eyes rolled back. Not dramatically, not theatrically, slowly, like a man falling into water. His spine arched, his hands clenched, and he began to mutter in Latin. Fluent, flowing, faster than Hughes could keep up. Objects began to shake. The chair beneath Roland scraped across the floor, though no one pushed it. A drawer slammed shut in the next room. Hughes continued to pray. Then the boy screamed. Not a child's scream. Something guttural, animal. It echoed through the room, bounced off the walls, set the chandelier above them swinging. The lights flickered and, for a moment, went out entirely. When they came back on, Roland sat still, breathing hard, skin pale, and on his arm, carved freshly, were the words, "Leave." Father Hughes did. He consulted his superiors, wrote his own report, hesitated, and then finally requested permission for the real thing, a sanctioned Catholic exorcism. But his request was denied, at least at first. Too many unknowns, too much public risk. The church is cautious with these things. Quiet. Always quiet. In the meantime, Hughes returned to the family once more. One last effort, one last prayer. It did not go well. Roland, when approached, flew into a frenzy. He had to be restrained by his father, his uncle, and eventually by the priest himself. The boy spat at them, cursed in Latin, then English, then something no one recognized. He twisted violently, his body bucking against the mattress, screaming for hours, until his voice broke and the room smelled like something had died in it. Hughes was injured in the struggle. A slash across the shoulder, deep, ugly. From what? No one could say. He left the house that night with his vestments torn and his hands shaking. He would never see Roland again. The church moved carefully after that, transferred the case out of Washington entirely, quietly. No announcements, no headlines, just a family ushered into a train station in the middle of the night. boarding a car headed west. Destination, St. Louis. There, a new team would take over. Jesuits, experienced, prepared, men who had read the ancient texts, who knew the rites not as symbols, but as weapons. If the thing inside Roland Doe was real, and more believed that it was, it would not go quietly. But even on the train, the strange continued. Passengers reported cold gusts in closed compartments, doors that wouldn't stay shut. Roland lay still for most of the ride, eyes open, lips moving. At one point, he reached over and wrote something on the window with his finger. Condensation had gathered from the outside. The words he traced stayed for hours. Save us. They arrived in St. Louis in silence. A cousin took them in. The family settled briefly into a spare room, tight quarters, but clean. The church had already begun its arrangements. Father William S. Blatty was to be the lead exorcist, mid-50s, veteran of the faith, educated, restrained, methodical. He had seen war, seen suffering. He was not one to scare easily. Alongside him would be Father Walter Halloran, a young priest barely 30, assigned to assist and observe. He would later become the primary witness to the entire affair. He would never forget it. Their first meeting with Roland was not what they expected. He was calm, slight, tired. He smiled politely, shook hands, asked for water. But then, as Bowden opened his notebook, Roland's chair slid backwards of his own accord, and the boy's face changed. It didn't twist. It didn't snarl. It emptied, as if something else had leaned forward just behind the eyes. And then, without moving his lips, he said, "You were too late." Bowden said nothing, just nodded, closed the book, and began to pray. St. Louis in early spring was cold, grey, and indifferent. The kind of weather that makes old buildings creak louder, where churches loom larger, and silence feels a little too thick around the edges. Father William Bowden had seen suffering. He'd served as a military chaplain in the Second World War, and had ministered to men who no longer recognized their own hands after the things they'd done. He knew how trauma behaved, knew how the mind tried to protect itself by breaking quietly. What he was now asked to face, though, was not a mind, but something older, something that laughed when prayers were whispered and scratched words into teenage skin when no one was watching. The church had chosen him for a reason. He was level-headed, not prone to panic, not eager for spectacle. He believed in the power of ritual, yes, but not as performance. For Bowden, the rites weren't theatre. They were war. He reviewed the notes carefully, read everything Hughes had written, spoke to the family, interviewed the boy, watched, listened, prayed, and finally he agreed. The church gave its consent for a formal, sanctioned exorcism. It would take place not in a church, but in a hospital. The Alexian Brothers Hospital in South St. Louis. One of the old wings had been shut off, repurposed for long-term observation. It was quiet, austere, removed from public view. The staff had been briefed, vaguely. The boy was ill. The treatment would be intense. They were not to disturb the room unless asked. The first session began on March 16th, 1949. Bowden arrived dressed in full priestly garb, black cassock, white surplice, purple stole. He brought with him the Roman ritual of 1614, a heavy book with worn edges and dog-eared pages. He brought holy water, a crucifix, relics, and a rosary that had belonged to his mother. Assisting him was Father Halloran, younger, stronger, less certain, and a handful of others who came and went as the days blurred into nights and back again. No cameras, no press, Just whispered names in hospital corridors and the endless sound of Latin breaking against the walls like waves. The first thing they noticed was the smell. It hit before they opened the door. Thick, foul, earthy, like sweat and decay and something left rotting in a locked room. But the windows were open. The room was clean. Nothing explained it. Roland lay strapped to the bed. Not violently, not cruelly. The restraints were there for safety. He had already injured himself, had lashed out without warning. They couldn't risk him falling, or worse, throwing himself through the glass. He was calm when they entered. Calm, but not blank. He looked at them with eyes that were entirely too old for his face. Not frightened, not pleading, just waiting. Bowden began the ritual. He read clearly, firmly, calling upon the name of Christ, invoking saints, angels, and Michael the Archangel in particular. The words were ancient, weighted. The kind of words that weren't supposed to be said aloud unless something very real and very dangerous was listening. Roland reacted immediately. He arched his back, screamed once, short, guttural, like something being pulled out of him. Then he began to curse, not in English, in Latin. And then, seamlessly, in languages none of the priests recognized. One voice, then another. Each distinct. Each with a cadence that didn't belong to a child. Objects in the room rattled, the bed shook, a holy water vial cracked in Bowden's hand. He kept reading. The boy thrashed against the straps, his body jerking unnaturally. At one point, deep scratches appeared on his chest, spelling out what looked like hell. The word remained visible for days. Over the course of the next week, the exorcisms continued, night after night, sometimes lasting 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. The boy would convulse, shout, spit, swear. He spoke of things he shouldn't have known. He named sins, described secret doubts the priests had never voiced aloud. He called Bowden by his childhood nickname, called Halloran by his mother's maiden name. Sometimes he wept, quiet, broken sobs in his own voice, pleading for help, apologizing. Then, just as quickly, the voice would shift and he would laugh. A deep, throaty laugh that sent chills through men who had buried their fear long ago. Bowden kept detailed notes. He didn't sensationalize. He recorded the temperature of the room, the smells, the marks, the speech patterns. He tried to treat it like medicine, something to be diagnosed and cured. But late at night, when the chanting had stopped and the boy slept, sweating, exhausted, he sat alone in the chapel and asked questions no priest ever wants to admit he's thinking. Was this a demon? Or was it madness? And if it was madness, why did it answer to scripture? The hospital staff began to whisper. Orderlies refused to enter the room. Nurses crossed themselves as they passed in the corridor. One night, a crucifix shattered on the floor. No one had touched it. No one had even entered the room. And still, the exorcism continued. One night, Roland bit through the leather strap on his wrist. Another, he vomited a black, tar-like fluid that stained the sheets and left a foul stench that couldn't be scrubbed out. Halloran was injured more than once. Clawed, punched, nearly thrown across the room when Roland's body surged upward with force no boy should have had. They tried to move him. Back to the house. Back to familiar surroundings. The episodes followed. In one session, as Bowden placed the crucifix on the boy's chest, Roland shrieked and recoiled. His skin blistered where the metal had touched him. The shape of the cross remained for hours, red and angry against his ribs. Still, they prayed. Still, They fought. Because now, the question wasn't whether something was wrong. It was how far it would go, and whether they'd survive it. It was during the third week that the voices truly began. Not just curses or muttered Latin, but full conversations, conducted in tones and languages that no one in the room understood. Roland's mouth would move in rhythm, but the cadence was off. Too fast. Too fluid. The sounds coming out of him felt layered, as if several people were speaking at once, all fighting for the same breath. Sometimes it was a whisper, like wind curling through a graveyard gate. Sometimes it was thunder, loud enough to rattle the window panes and send the lights flickering. But the worst were the moments when the voice was quiet, measured, calm. It was then that he said the most disturbing things. One night, as Father Halloran read from the Gospels, Roland turned his head slowly and said, in perfect French, "Do you think he's listening? Or do you say his name because you're afraid of your own?" Neither of them spoke French, but the words were later translated, and they were exact. Another time, he recited the names of every priest present, including middle names and dates of baptism. He listed their confessions, their private doubts, things they had whispered alone in churches miles away years ago. The effect was cumulative, not explosive, but relentless. Sleep deprivation, psychological erosion, spiritual nausea. The kind that wears down even the faithful, even the trained. The temperature in the room fluctuated constantly, freezing one moment, burning the next. The crucifix above the bed blackened over time, as if scorched from the inside. The boys' sheets had to be changed daily, not just from sweat or vomit, but because of the words that appeared on them overnight. They were always scratched, never written. Ragged letters, scrawled across cotton like claw marks. Sometimes they were gibberish. Sometimes prayers, reversed. Once, a single word in large, jagged letters. Trapped. He was getting weaker. Physically, at least. His body was thin, fragile. His wrists bruised from the straps. His hair damp most of the time, stuck to his forehead as if fevered. But what spoke through him was stronger than ever. One night, in a moment of stillness between prayers, his back arched and he began to chant in a low, guttural language that no one recognized. The walls groaned. A mirror across the room cracked diagonally with a clean, impossible sound. And then Roland laughed. A long, hollow laugh that came from somewhere far deeper than his lungs. Father Bowden pressed on. He read, louder, sharper. He called on the angels, named the saints one by one, demanded the spirit reveal itself. What followed was silence, and then softly in Roland's own voice, "I am many." The room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Halloran dropped the candle he was holding. The wax splashed across his shoe like blood. Roland looked at them, eyes wide, lips trembling. "Don't listen," he whispered. "Please don't listen." Then he screamed. His body thrashed so violently that the bed shifted sideways on the floor. One of the straps snapped. His arm flew free and struck Father Halloran across the jaw, hard enough to split the skin. It took 3 men to restrain him again. That night, the scratches on his body formed the word exit. Bowden wrote it down. Along with the others, lie, pain, burn, death, mine. Each mark appeared with intention. Each stayed just long enough to fade into bruises. They documented everything, and still they didn't stop. Sometimes Roland would come to crying. He didn't remember what had happened, or claim not to. He begged to go home, said he was sorry, Said he'd been dreaming about a dark figure sitting in the corner of the room, whispering things he didn't understand. They asked him what the figure looked like. He said, "He has no face, just teeth." By the end of the month, the priests were exhausted, physically, spiritually. The church had sent reinforcements, other clergy who came in for a day or two, just long enough to witness what was happening before returning to their own parishes in hushed silence. None of them stayed long. Each night, the ritual was the same. Each night, the boy twisted and spat and bled and laughed. And each night, the question returned in Bowden's mind. Persistent, ugly. What if this doesn't work? What if this is something they cannot cast out? And if so, what happens when it decides to stop pretending it's trapped? It wasn't one night that broke them. It was all of them, one after the other, folding in like damp pages in an old book. Every evening began the same way. Latin prayers, holy water, whispered encouragements exchanged between tired men with bloodshot eyes. Every evening ended with violence. Not chaos, worse, repetition. Because madness, like liturgy, lives in what repeats. By now, the room was stripped of comfort. The sheets always stained, the air always too warm or too cold, the lights unreliable. No crucifix stayed on the wall for more than a few hours. Every time they hammered one back into place, it would fall. Once it exploded without warning, just as Bowden lifted his voice during the litany of the saints. The priests learned to stop reacting. They stood with bruised hands and tired backs, murmuring words older than their fear, watching a boy twist into something that looked more and more like a parody of himself. His skin had grown pale, almost translucent in places, his ribs showing clearly, each breath a visible labor. But his strength had not waned. If anything, it grew. Father Halloran bore the worst of it. As the youngest and strongest, he was the one to hold Roland down when the spasms came. His arms were clawed more than once, his lips split open after a headbutt he didn't see coming. Once, Roland bit through his sleeve, left marks that would scar for life. Still, he returned each night. He told himself it was duty. Later he would admit, only once, that it was something more, that he wanted to see it through. Not for the church, not even for the boy, but because deep down, something in him needed to know it was real, that it wasn't all in their heads, that evil had shape, that the rituals meant something. But belief is a fragile thing, and the thing in the room knew it. It began taunting them, not just curses now, not just filth, but intimacy. It spoke in their own voices, mocked their fears, quoted their private confessions. Halloran once dropped to his knees in the middle of a session, sobbing, as Roland, eyes wide and unblinking, recited a memory from the priest's childhood that he had never spoken aloud. Bowden didn't stop him. He just kept reading. He had learned by then not to look up when the voice changed, not to flinch when the Latin was thrown back at him in perfect pronunciation, not to answer questions like, "Do you still believe he's listening?" Because deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. The church offered little support. Letters sent to the archdiocese were returned days later with vague encouragements and continued approval. No one came to replace them. No one took over. It was as if the whole institution had stepped 2 paces back and watched through a veil. They were alone, and outside the room, the world moved on. Spring came. Children played in the street. The church bells rang. Easter approached. And in a shuttered hospital wing, a boy's voice cried out in languages no one could trace. his limbs jerking against leather straps, his eyes glowing in a way that no candlelight could explain. One night, everything stopped. Roland had been unusually still that day. His breathing slow, shallow. He didn't respond when they entered. Didn't open his eyes when Bowden began the rite. Halloran approached cautiously, laid a hand on the boy's wrist. Nothing. Then suddenly, Roland sat upright, completely straight, without using his arms, and began screaming. Not words, just sound. A shrill, steady wail that seemed to stretch past the limits of his body. The windows shuddered. Bowden clutched his chest, staggered back 2 steps. Halloran couldn't move. It lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, Roland collapsed unconscious. Blood trickled from his nose. The wall behind him was cracked. Later that night, Father Bowden wrote a single sentence in his journal. I do not know what this is, but I believe it sees us. They slept in shifts after that, or tried to. Halloran began having dreams, none of which he remembered, but all of which left him soaked in sweat, waking up gasping. One of the nurses on the floor reported hearing chanting through the vents. She resigned the following morning. Then came the night when Roland almost died. His breathing stopped. Just for a moment. Maybe 2. No pulse, no reaction. Halloran froze. Bowden dropped his prayer book. And then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the boy's chest heaved and he sat up, gasping. He looked around the room with absolute clarity. I saw him, he whispered. He's waiting. They asked who. He didn't answer. After that, something changed. The atmosphere thickened. Time warped. Objects in the room no longer obeyed gravity. A chair levitated once, fully, silently, then fell. The lights grew dim even when replaced. Holy water steamed when poured. And the voice, if it was a voice, began to speak in plural. We are, it would say. We have always been. This is not your house. He gave it freely. The priests no longer argued. They just read. Their voices hoarse, dry, reciting lines they had long since memorized. Eyes red, hands trembling. Not because of fear anymore, but because they were beginning to understand that faith alone might not be enough. April 18th, 1949. The hospital room was silent save for the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. A sound no one had noticed in weeks. It ticked evenly, steadily, like it wasn't afraid, like it didn't care. That morning, Roland had been quiet. Still bound, but loose now. Not thrashing, not screaming, just still. His face pale, lips dry, eyes half-lidded and unfocused, like someone underwater, staring up at a sun they could no longer feel. The priests entered as they always did. Bowden first. Halloran behind him. The others had stopped attending regularly. Some had become ill, others simply left without explanation. Only those who had surrendered their need to understand remained. That day's ritual began like the rest. Holy water, prayers, a line of scripture. Bowden had whispered 100 times already. He didn't expect anything different. He no longer expected anything. He simply spoke, voice low and unwavering, like a man rowing through fog, one stroke at a time, hoping the shore still existed. And then Roland opened his mouth. He didn't scream. He spoke clearly, calmly, slowly. He is here. The voice wasn't angry, not twisted, not foreign. It was his, unmistakably his. And then came the change. His body arched, not violently, not in panic, but with a strange precision of something preparing for impact. His lips moved again, But this time, what came out was not his voice. "I am Michael." Bowden stopped reading. Halloran stepped forward instinctively, unsure whether to speak or kneel. "I am Michael," the voice repeated, stronger now. "I stand for light, for truth, for the one who cast you out." The room went still. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight behind them. Something shifted. The tension that had lingered for weeks, the nausea in the walls, the distortion of time, all of it froze, as if listening. And then the boy shouted. Not in fear, not in rage. It was command. "You will leave now." A pause. Then screaming. Not Roland, something else. A long, howling, ragged scream that tore through the room like metal against metal. It vibrated through their bones, made the light bulbs burst, sent every object in the room shaking. The bed lifted off the ground, fully, hovered for a breathless second, and then slammed back down so hard that the floor beneath cracked. Then silence. Roland collapsed backward. Not dramatically. Not with flair. Just down. Like someone too tired to stand any longer. His arms fell limp. His chest rose and fell once. Then again. Slower. He blinked, looked around the room, and whispered, "He's gone." Father Bowden didn't respond. He couldn't. For the first time in over a month, the boy's eyes were his. No shadow behind them. No storm. Just exhaustion. Deep and clean, like someone waking from a terrible dream they couldn't quite remember. The priests sat down. Not out of ceremony. Not out of reverence. Just because their legs could no longer hold them. Outside, the sun had begun to rise. There were no fireworks, no angelic choirs, no dramatic, supernatural finale. Just a boy, asleep at last. Just 4 men, trembling in silence. Just a room, finally still. Later they checked him. No scratches, no burns, no words carved into skin. The air felt different, warmer, heavier with dust, but without the weight of something watching. Roland slept for 18 hours straight. When he woke, he asked for water, then toast, then his mother. He remembered nothing. At least that's what he said. And no one asked twice. Over the following days, the changes held. No more fits, no more voices, no more destruction. The crucifix above his bed remained where it was. His sheets stayed clean. The mirror no longer cracked. On April 24th, the church ended the exorcism. The file was closed. The rituals stopped. Bowden returned to his parish. Halloran went back to teaching. The room in the hospital was sealed, later repurposed, eventually forgotten. Except by those who had been there. Father Halloran would later say it was the most terrifying experience of his life. That he never again encountered anything remotely like it. He never used the word demon directly. Not in interviews, not even in letters. But he also never denied it. Father Bowden spoke of it even less. His journal, though sparse, ended with a single phrase in Latin. Non nobis Domine, sed nomini tuo da gloriam. Not to us, O Lord, but to your name be the glory. As for Roland, he disappeared from public view. The church kept its promise. His real name was never released. He went back to school, graduated, worked quietly in government for decades, married, retired. He never spoke publicly of what had happened, but the story remained. Passed from priest to priest, whispered in seminaries, discussed in hushed tones over whiskey and candlelight. It became the basis for books. Then a novel. Then, eventually, a film. The Exorcist. But long before Hollywood added spinning heads and green vomit, there had been this. A boy. a board, a scream in the dark, and 4 priests clinging to faith like a match in the wind. It would be comforting to say that everything returned to normal, that the shadows evaporated, the whispers vanished, and the boy lived happily ever after. But comfort rarely tells the truth. Roland Doe, whoever he truly was, did not become a media sensation. He didn't write a memoir, didn't spend his 20s giving interviews on late-night television. He simply faded back into the folds of ordinary life. After the exorcism, he and his family moved again. Quietly. No forwarding address, no announcement. The church ensured the records were sealed. Even the hospital file vanished from official archives, surviving only through handwritten notes passed privately between clergy. In his new school, Roland was just another student. Pale, quiet, polite. The kind who always turned in his homework on time, but never raised his hand. He made a few friends, played baseball, attended church without complaint. Some teachers described him as oddly gentle. Others found him hard to read. None of them knew. None of them were told. The scars faded, at least the visible ones. He had no memory of what had happened, or so he claimed. If dreams disturbed his sleep, he never mentioned them. If certain words made his skin crawl, no one saw. He lived like someone walking over thin ice, lightly, carefully, always forward. Years passed. He graduated, found work in the federal government. Nothing glamorous. He married, had children, paid bills, mowed his lawn, attended PTA meetings. For all intents and purposes, he was exactly what the world loves best. Normal. But silence does not mean peace. Those who had witnessed what he had been, what had spoken through him, never truly let go. Father Halloran carried the memories for decades, sharing only pieces, not to frighten, but to warn. Bowden took them to his grave. Neither man would ever again speak of evil in abstract terms. And Roland? He lived his life without incident. No reports of further possession, no odd behavior, no relapses. But there were small things. A reluctance to enter churches alone, a refusal to ever touch a Ouija board again, even as a joke. A tendency to sleep with the light on, even as an adult. His wife once remarked that he was the only man she knew who could wake up mid-sentence from a nightmare, already apologizing. He never told her why. When The Exorcist was released in 1973, Roland was in his early 40s. He did not attend a screening. He did not sue the author. He did not deny the source material. He simply let the noise pass around him like wind through dry grass. William Peter Blatty, the author of the novel, had heard the story through a professor at Georgetown, a Jesuit who had known Bowden. The details were changed, of course. A girl instead of a boy. A fictionalized city. A cinematic climax. But the bones of it were real. The possession, the priests, the fight. When journalists tried to trace the story back, they ran into walls. Pseudonyms, missing files, dead ends. The church offered no comment. The hospital said nothing. And Roland remained silent. By all accounts, he died peacefully in the early 2000s. No headlines, no confession. Just an obituary in a local paper, noting his decades of service, his surviving family, and a small note that he had once been a quiet boy from Maryland. But in the margins of theology classrooms, in the private notebooks of exorcists, and in the unspoken memories of those who still believe in the possibility of something darker, his story endures, not as a warning, but as a question. The story was never meant to become a phenomenon. It was meant to be buried, deep in church files, beneath layers of secrecy, sacrament, and shame. But stories like this don't rot. They ferment. In 1949, shortly after the final exorcism, a handful of priests and scholars exchanged quiet letters. They debated what had happened, whether it could be called possession in the true theological sense, whether the rituals had been properly performed, whether the outcome proved anything or nothing at all. But outside that small clerical circle, the world moved on. There was no front page article, no press conference, just silence until someone broke it. A Jesuit priest at Georgetown University, one of Bowden's confidants, shared the tale with a young student named William Peter Blatty. It wasn't detailed. It wasn't even dramatic. Just the outline. A boy, a possession, a series of exorcisms, and the battle between faith and whatever it was that doesn't flinch at holy water. That was all Blatty needed. He turned it into fiction, changed the gender, shifted the location, added more gore, more drama, more spinning heads. But the spine of the thing, the trembling idea that something ancient and hostile had taken root inside a child, remained intact. In 1971, The Exorcist was published. It was an instant success. People devoured it. Not because they believed in demons, though many did, but because it touched something older than belief. Fear. Fear that there are things in the dark that do not care if you believe in them. 2 years later, the film adaptation arrived. Directed by William Friedkin, it was a cultural earthquake. Audiences fainted in theaters, vomited, walked out, ran back in. Churches condemned it. Evangelists preached against it. And still, they came in droves. It was more than a horror film. It was an event. A mass exorcism of denial. A shared scream. People claimed to see things during screenings. Cold spots. Shadows moving across the floor. Some said the film itself was cursed. Actors injured. Crew members dying under strange circumstances. A set that mysteriously burned down, except for the girls' room, which was untouched. All of it fed the fire. And behind it, the real boy. The real story. Slowly fading into fiction. As the decades passed, The Exorcist became the blueprint for everything that followed. Books, films, documentaries, endless sequels and prequels. It cemented the modern image of possession. The contorted body, the foul language, the rotating head, the projectile vomit. But none of that happened in St. Louis. There were no levitations, no head spins, no green bile, just pain, sleepless nights, a boy in restraints, and 4 men trying to hold the line with prayer alone. Some critics later accused the church of exaggeration, that Roland's case was merely one of severe psychological trauma, that the priests saw what they wanted to see, that the scratches were self-inflicted, the voices rehearsed, that the rituals had only reinforced the delusion. Others pointed to the consistency, the witnesses, the unexplainable marks, the languages never learned, the reactions to sacred objects, the way hardened men who had buried soldiers in Europe returned from that hospital room, afraid. The debate continues, in lecture halls, in Reddit threads, in seminary basements where young priests whisper to one another after lights out. Was it real? Was it staged? Was it both? And more importantly, does it matter? Because the story has taken on a life of its own. It is no longer confined to dusty Vatican drawers or fading VHS tapes. It lives in culture, in memes, in Halloween costumes, in podcasts that dissect the original case, in TikToks with candlelight filters and AI voices reading Latin backwards. The line between reality and myth is blurred, and perhaps that's the most dangerous part. Because when a real horror becomes an entertainment product, it can no longer be contained. It spreads, mutates, seduces, And those who come after teenagers in dark bedrooms with candles and curiosity forget that some stories began not with screams, but with silence, with grief, with a boy who missed his aunt, with a question whispered to a wooden board, and something that whispered back. There's a moment, just before sleep, when your mind slips sideways. You're not awake, not dreaming, just floating, like driftwood between tides. That's where the story lives now, somewhere in the in-between. Because what happened to Roland Doe isn't easy to file away. There are those who say it was all real, that a demon, multiple demons, took root in the boy's body and refused to leave until driven out by centuries-old rites and enough holy water to drown a city. And maybe they're right. There are those who say it was all psychological, a trauma response, a grieving, sensitive child wrapped too tightly in religious belief and the quiet desperation of his family. And maybe they're right too. But maybe the truth isn't either of those things. Maybe it's worse. Maybe the real horror isn't the demon, but the idea that no one really knew what was happening and did it anyway. That grown men read from books they barely understood. That a boy was strapped down night after night, screamed at in Latin, burned by crosses, bruised by holy intentions. That no one truly asked what he wanted, what he needed, whether he was just lost in the dark, waiting for someone to light a match instead of calling in an army. Maybe belief can be its own kind of possession. Or maybe, just maybe, the thing they fought wasn't inside the boy, but around him, in the grief, the silence, the fear. And maybe it never really left. Because stories like this don't go away. They wait. In church basements, in movie queues, in the back of your mind when the lights are off and something creaks in the hallway. So here's the question, sleepless rabble, just between you and me. If Roland had picked up that board today instead of in 1949, would he still have been possessed? Or would he have ended up on TikTok, lip-syncing to ghost filters, drowning in comments that called him fake? Would anyone have believed him? Would anyone have helped? Or would we have watched and called it content? Sleep well, if you can.